안녕하십니까. 새해 복 많이 받으십시오. Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Let me first of all wish you a very happy new year. And secondly, as we informed you previously, I just want to let you know that the Institute for Global Economics chose a new chairman to succeed me. Dr. Chen Guanghu, who is former Korean government's Financial Services Commission, and also he was chairman of the pension services, which manage the fund that consists of total assets worth $600 billion under his tenure. In fact, this NPS became real significant global player in financial and the investment markets. So he was former chief economist in World Bank for many years. Anyway, so he will lead Institute for Global Economics. Obviously, I'm not retiring. I will stay at the Institute and to support him as the founder and the with the new title of Chairman Emeritus. So I will support him and participate in the activities. I just trust all of you continuously support the IGE and participate actively in all the activities. Well, with this, I just want to say a few words about Dr. Alan Sinai. In fact, Dr. Alan Sinai has been with us at the beginning of New Year, last 25 years. And we've been friends for many years. In fact, he is in the economic forecasting, not only the United States, global economic forecast and financial market forecast for many decades. And as you know, economic forecasting is really hazardous business. But he not only survived in the economic forecasting, but he distinguished himself as the most accurate forecaster named by Wall Street Journal and many professional media, in fact. And so, you know, he in earlier days when he was young, he's still young, but when he was real.
We've grown old together.
When he was real young, and he was econometric model builder for economic forecasting with Harvard University's Otto Eckstein, and the other side is Lawrence Klein, Nobel laureate, who read WEFA, and this team is TRI. And then suddenly he is not real, you know, ivory tower armchair economic forecaster. He really worked with financial markets himself. He's an investor. He made a lot of money as well. And so that is important. But anyway, so Alan Sinai has been with us almost every year, the last 25 years. But today, there are many thinkings and many thoughts about economic future, particularly U.S. economy and the Chinese economy. So Alan will enlighten us in this regard. I just want to the quote, very interesting, thing said, Time magazine, he was on the member of the Time magazine board of economists, 1991 to 2002. Time magazine said about him as anyone who thinks economics is a dismal science has never been treated to the vivid commentaries of Alan Sinai. And this is what Time magazine said. And I hope, again, he will enlighten us, as he always do, about the future of U.S. and global economy and the global financial markets in particular. Well, with no further ado, I will ask Dr. Chan take over the podium, please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sagong, for excellent introduction and warm words for me as I begin Chairman position at IGE. We have a long list of questions, topics to discuss, so I would like to move on quickly. But before I do that, just please allow me to say a few words. One is good news, the other bad news. Let me start with the bad news. That is that following remarkable achievement and leadership Dr. Sagong has demonstrated over the last 2.5 decades is very difficult to emulate, if not impossible. So there is bad news. But if you can turn things around, of course, your continued support and active participation in our IG programs from now on will help relieve the burden on the part of the new chairman. But good news that I really would like to share with you is that Dr. Sagong is still very young and energetic. So there's no retirement in his dictionary. So please expect him to be even more active down the road to help lead IGE activities in many years to come. With that, I would like to move on. Dr. Sinai has been already introduced, so I would like to give the floor to you, Dr. Sinai. Thank you. All yours.
Well, I want to thank all of you once again for welcoming me here near the start of this year, 2019. It is about the 25th year that I've spoken to this group. It's always a delight to come to Seoul. It's always a delight. I can see clearly now that I'm here in Seoul. It's quite clear compared to Boston, which has been terrible. So the weather in Boston has been awful so far. Thank you and congratulations, Dr. Kwang Woo and Ilse Kong. Our alliances, conversations go back so many years. We're too young to tell people how long that has been. So in my lexicon, my dictionary, there's only one word that describes aging. It's older. No one is allowed to say old in anywhere around me. So as we get older, some of us, not me, get wiser. We certainly have a lot more experience. And I am sure that at the end of my talk, I'm going to give you the one experience, the one conversation, meeting of sorts that I've had with the current president of the United States, President Trump, which I think will give you some insight as it has me, into why he won the election in 2016. And probably, I think, will be a one-term president. But putting politics and geopolitics aside for the moment, it's hard to do that because so much is going on in the world, so many changes so fast, so much turmoil, so much chaos geopolitically that it's mind-boggling. But I have to walk away from that and try to isolate what's going on in economies and markets around the world and policies that affect economies and markets, regardless of the politics and geopolitics, which are of an exogenous nature to some extent. And so the topic for today is a topic of expansion. The business cycle expansion in the U.S., soon to be the longest ever. Korea isn't the 5% growth a year economy that it once was, but has had 3 or 4 very good years on a GDP growth basis. The world economy, we look at 47 countries, major countries, about 93% of world output, and the world economy has been in expansion, mixed around the world. A key question for 2019 is, will the expansion continue? Our answer is yes. The U.S. and global economic expansion, it can keep going. 2018 was a year of expansion. There was a lift up and off for the United States to a 3% plus growth path after 2.5% in 2017. We are projecting for this year, even with a weakening trade and some hesitation on the part of business, close to 3% growth in real GDP for the United States in 2019. I'm going to give you the reasons why in a little bit. I just want to give you some bottom line answers now. That is a very good year. That would represent pretty much the third year of a new path of growth for the U.S. economy that I call the new normal. Because prior to 2017, the U.S. economy grew for 7 years at about a 2% annual rate. And so many economists then talked about the U.S. being in secular stagnation, and we are no longer there. The question is, will the expansion continue? And in that expansion in the United States, will the supply side of the economy grow enough so as to give more room for expansion without inflation that will allow the potential of the U.S. economy to accommodate a period of prosperity that will go beyond the 1 year or so that we have been in prosperity. The United States economy is in prosperity in the here and now. That's technically a stage in the business cycle as I look at it. But it is that way to Americans, American consumers. It is that way because the unemployment rate is very low, the lowest in decades. It is that way because so many people are earning money, spending money. The stores are full. The online commerce is full. American consumer confidence is high. The financial position of households is strong, unbelievably strong. For this long, chronologically long an expansion where normally we don't get this far. It's prosperity. It feels, looks like it, the data say it. That's the way it is now in the U.S. It got that way last year, mainly from a long period of easy monetary policy and the workings of the innards of the economy, and to some extent from the tax cuts and increased federal government purchases that came out of the fiscal side of what we call Trumponomics, fiscal stimulus. That stimulus, by the way, on Joint Committee of Taxation numbers in 2019 will be double the size it was in 2018. So that fiscal stimulus is going to be stronger in 2018 than it was in 2017, with the behavioral effects from 2018 lingering into 2019. That is a major reason, a taking over of the reins of growth from the fiscal stimulus side in 2019 as monetary policy gets less accommodative. The policy mix, fiscal stimulus, less easy monetary policy but still accommodative, is part of why our forecast has the U.S. economy growing at 3%. Many analysts think the fiscal stimulus effects will fade. My work, my research over many decades on tax cuts of all kinds says the tax cut growth effects are stronger than the effects of increased government spending, and they last longer. That is a result of what went on in the business cycle expansion of the 1960s. That was the tax cuts of Kennedy-Johnson. That was a result of the Reaganomics tax cut stimulus of the 1980s. And what I've just said is a result of the second President Bush tax cuts of 2003 to 2006, which until all those bubbles burst and our economy turned down, was giving us some very strong growth. Tax cuts work. Why do they work? I'm a simple-minded economist. You take $1 out of the government pot that is sitting there, and you throw it to households and businesses, tax cuts. So the deficit goes up $1. Not being spent, it's not an addition. It goes into the private sector, it gets spent and saved. It's an addition. And then it makes its way around the horn in a cycle of effects that keeps going. The deficit, yes, goes up. But if growth goes up as the deficit goes up, the deficit to GDP ratio does not go up quite as fast as people would think. The debt to GDP ratio may not go up depending on how much the tax cuts stimulate growth and nominal GDP growth. And this is a result of history. I am not saying anything new. The tax cuts of 2017, $138 billion for 2018, ex ante planned, were 55% for business, the biggest business tax cut in history, one that both Democrats and Republicans wanted on the tax rate because the U.S. tax rate was so much higher than so many other countries. And the other parts of it, it's all permanent. It's going to last until at least after the next election. It can't be overturned. The household tax cuts were 45% of that $138 billion. Together, 0.7% of GDP. It's clear in the data on both spending and saving that in the second, third, and fourth quarters, consumers spent and saved the extra tax cuts along with other sources of increased disposable income because consumer spending lifted up over 3% year over year, and as about 70% of the U.S. economy, so did the U.S. economy. That's the major driving source of growth for the U.S. economy in 2018, and we think will be in 2019, and should carry over into 2020. The consumer as an engine of growth. That's good news for Korea, not in the crosshairs of trade wars and trade fights with the president, with America. It's good news for China, depending on how the trade talks go. It's good news for Canada and Mexico because American consumers and business people spend a lot on goods and services from overseas, produce in a lot of places outside the United States, and in this way help other economies do better. The tax cuts this year will be more for households than business. 1.3% of GDP, $280 billion. It's more than double last year's stimulus. Households get the majority of that. They'll see it in April in their tax bills that will be lower for most all. In absolute dollars, definitely the higher income families will have more dollars, but percentage-wise, all families are going to get something. They'll see it more in April. And on the tax cuts, so-called tax cuts, which favor the rich, so called that in so much of the media and by so many analysts, there are a lot of high-income families who will pay higher taxes because they live in states where mortgage deductions, real estate tax, and state and local tax deductions will not be allowed on their tax return. They will have a lower marginal tax rate, but they won't be able to take all the deductions they took before. And so their tax bills will go up. The state of Massachusetts is one, the state of New York is another. And so it's not quite right to bill this as tax cuts for the rich. Nor was it in all the other times we did tax reductions, whatever they were, many for business, many for households, that resulted in higher growth. This is a major reason why our forecast is at the upper end of consensus. We're at the upper end, 3% growth. The lower end, I would say, is in the low twos. Very few people, though the odds differ, are talking about a recession in the U.S. economy in 2019. The next 12 months, and I'm going to go through why expansions end with you, we would put the odds very, very low of a recession in the United States over this next 12 months, no more than 5%. No more than 5%. Now, it's interesting to have that view and to be here in the middle of a big stock market correction in the U.S. and other stock markets of the world, which in 2018 produced negative years in the major stock markets in almost all countries. But you know, it's not so odd to see this big difference between Main Street and Wall Street. Wall Street does well when Main Street isn't doing well. Wall Street does well because when the U.S. economy moves from unemployment rate of 10% down to 3.9, in that process is more growth, more earnings, low interest rates to keep it going, and that's what drives stock prices, earnings and interest rates on fundamental valuation. Ahead of that time, the stock market does well. So Wall Street is the first to benefit. Real estate is the first to benefit from stimulative economies, easy money that gets an economy lifting up. When Main Street finally delivers the goods that Wall Street has predicted, like any time in the stock market, the news has been discounted. You sell the reality, you buy the story. That's, I believe, what happened last year. We had two big corrections in the United States having to do with a lot of stuff that really wasn't that fundamental. The one fundamental that is of concern to us as a sneaky way the U.S. could fall into recession is the way we fell into recession in the late 1990s after a wonderful decade of growth, a decade that the U.S. now looks like it's in, this part, the last few years, where the business sector, because of an internet bubble bursting and weak sales from outside the U.S., cut back on hiring, was the proximate cause of the downturn. It wasn't high interest rates. It wasn't too high inflation. It was the cutbacks by the business sector, hurting jobs growth and employment, hurting income, the confidence of consumers. Consumers then weakened, and we worked our way into the recession of 2000, 2001 in a very sneaky way. The one time in 11 downturns that this operated the way I say. In 8 out of 11 expansions, said by 3 Federal Reserve chairpersons last Friday, I think in Atlanta, Georgia, 2 of the 3, expansions don't die of old age. Of course, these were said by older people, but I say the same thing. The chronological number means nothing. Expansions don't die of old age. They die because the Federal Reserve kills them. Famous quote of Rudy Dornbush, passed away some years ago. They don't die of old age. They die because the Federal Reserve murders them. And why does the Federal Reserve murder the expansion? Because inflation gets too high. for whatever it is tolerable to the Federal Reserve at that time. When inflation gets too high, because inflation lags the economy, the Federal Reserve has often not seen it, reacted too late, has to then catch up with higher interest rates. High inflation, high interest rates hurt purchasing power weakens. Then the financial institutions run into a problem from the higher interest rates, a credit crunch or a financial crisis. Down goes the economy. 8 downturns out of 11 come from that source, which is why if your speaker in a few weeks, Marty Feldstein, says what I saw him write in the Wall Street Journal, he was very pessimistic at the time because he was expecting higher inflation and the Federal Reserve to kill this expansion. Today, right now, that is not a worry. The second question to answer is, why is inflation so low everywhere in the world? And what now looks to be the case in the U.S. for 2019, inflation in the 1.75% range, below the target of the Federal Reserve of 2%. That's a half a point lower than we said 6 months ago. It's definitely a shift down in the rate of inflation, and in other countries as well. The rate of inflation in Korea is very low. It's running about 1.5%. It's very low in China. It's still very low in Japan. It's still very low in Europe. It's low everywhere. There's something going on out there that makes inflation low no matter how economies do. That low inflation has already made our Federal Reserve back away and talk much more dovishly, much more tenderly about how many times they'll raise interest rates this year. We are now talking about one hike by the Federal Reserve in June, maybe none, at most 2. In their latest meeting and plan, they said 2. If inflation stays low and short-term rates only go up 0.25 point in June, long-term rates may go up, but not very much, and interest rates and inflation causing higher interest rates will not kill the expansion in 2019. Maybe in 2020, but when you see much higher inflation and then the Federal Reserve has to raise interest rates a lot and then financial lending tightens up, it usually takes a year, 2 or 3 before the downturn comes. So in our view, we will not only expand at 3%, about 3% in 2019, we expect to see in the high 2s in 2020 and no recession. And I can't be sure there will be one or won't be one, but no recession until after the election of 2020. This view of expansion in the United States is a view that we have reached a higher growth path, that it will be sustained, that the Federal Reserve and inflation will not kill it. And just because it will reach the oldest age of any expansion we have ever had, uncharted territory, does not mean it will die of old age or be killed by the Fed. The big thing to worry about is inflation if it gets too high and the Fed changes and raises rates a lot faster. Right now, that looks like a very low probability. All the Federal Reserve members are signing on to the lower inflation picture and a softer, more gradual approach to raising interest rates, because we have raised them 9 times since 2015 already in the United States. We don't have to raise them much more. And that is a big change in the backdrop looking ahead for the U.S. to have reasonably low interest rates. Strong growth. With that growth should come a decline in the unemployment rate in the U.S. to 3.2 or 3.3% by the end of the year. We're at 3.9 now. What we're seeing in the U.S. labor market is an explosion of people coming in who were not working before because the labor market's very tight. Wage inflation beginning to pick up. We're running short of workers. It's not because of immigration. We're just running short because the economy is very strong. And thanks to, and I'll get to it in a moment, technology, wage inflation is not rising. Productivity growth is growing. And the U.S. economy is exhibiting a beautiful sight. Strong growth, a low unemployment rate, a lot of job creation, a relatively low inflation rate, and we had a tremendous gain in corporate profits, in part from the tax cuts of about 25% year over year in 2018. That's all going to continue more or less, is what I'm saying. A very nice picture of prosperity. One thing that will change will be the rate of growth of corporate earnings. We can't do 25% year after year. You can only find 3 or 4 examples of that in post-war history of the profits. We look at the S&P 500 corporate profits as a proxy for other profits. Profits growth will diminish. It will diminish some with whatever our growth rate diminishes. It'll diminish because costs will rise. And it will diminish because we had a tremendous pump of tax cuts, the majority of which went to business in 2018. But still, we will get a nice gain in corporate profits, corporate earnings, and that to us, and the expansion, and the relatively low interest rates are what will produce a U.S. stock market that could go up something like 7 or 8% after last year's big decline. And I might add other stock markets around the world should do well too. This is a very pretty picture for the United States in 2019. The expansion can be sustained in the U.S. One reason is the continuing accommodation by the Federal Reserve, 1 rate hike, and perhaps a 50 basis point increase in the 10-year U.S. Treasury yield, which now stands in the low 260s, 3.25%, fairly benign interest rates, and a lot of liquidity in the system from banks, a lot of liquidity in the private sector and household sector and the business sector. The federal government deficit as a percent of GDP will go up 5-6%. That is not of concern for the next year to 3 years for us. Longer run, it could be of concern when the day comes where interest rates might have to go up a lot, but that will only happen if inflation goes up a lot. It won't happen just because of increased deficit financing, given all the liquidity that sits in the private sector, in the system, and around the world at this time. For the rest of the world, for the global economy, we would argue that the global expansion will continue as well. We look at the global economy, we look at 47 countries that comprises 93% of output. The major components of that are the U.S., China, Japan. Let's think of the emerging world, the developing world less China. China is classed as a developing economy, but it's hardly a developing economy. It's a modern, mixed capitalistic, central government guided economy. And you have Europe and the Eurozone, the main parts of the global economy that we look at. The U.S. is no longer a guarantor of global growth, global expansion. That went away some years ago. The U.S. always is an engine of growth. Yes, certainly counts for other countries through exports, through U.S. production facilities that are activated during the U.S. expansion in other countries, and the hiring that goes on, and all of the now interwoven transactions, production, distribution, consumption that goes on around the world. But the U.S. On a GDP basis is no longer king of the hill in terms of the percentage of overall economic activity in the world. As of the end of 2017, 27% of global GDP was the U.S. In 2000, it was 33%. China, 17% of the global GDP in 2017. In the year 2000, 4%. Now, this is based on nominal GDP. None of us think that the GDP numbers that come out of China really measure the Chinese economy, but we can't prove it, and we can't say yes, we can't say no. Those are the numbers that China gives us. And if China grows 5 to 6.5% over the next 5 years, it will surpass the U.S. in terms of the percent of total GDP in the world that is in the Chinese corner. Let's face it. You know that out here in Asia. I don't think it's fully realized in the United States, although it is realized more and more as we lock horns on trade with a very tough and very sophisticated, smart country with, to me, very impressive leaders. The technocrats of China, the bureaucrats, the leaders of China, when I look at them from 30,000 feet up in that Korean Air, do you all fly Korean Air? I thought they were really good, but I'm not sure that here in Korea you think Korean Air is really good. But I had a wonderful flight, and from 36,000 feet up, I could look at the world, and I looked at Z from up there. You know, the technology is such now that even Al and Sinai can look down on the spot on Earth and see what's going on. I looked at Japan and Prime Minister Abe. I looked here at your President Moon, controversial, I know. I even saw Kim building more nuclear facilities, sneaking them in, outwitting Trump. And I couldn't find Trump because Trump was busy twittering. Never sleeps, and he was busy twittering. I couldn't find him. But you know, as a global investor and business person, what do you think the answer is to who has the best apparatus, the best government? It isn't the U.S. You have to be objective about this. Our functioning in Washington is a poor imitation of how a government should function. And Americans know this. They know it. They can't do anything about it. In part, they elected President Trump to fix it. And he did what he's always done, if you read The Art of the Deal and watch his career, what he's always done. He gets to the top, and then he doesn't know how to run the business. And if the people around him don't run the business the way he wants it, he gets rid of them. And I do think America will get rid of him. Because if he were on my board, and I was a board colleague, I would never have him on my board. You can't work with him. It's his way or no way. And if he ran my company and I was on the board, I'd fire him in a second because he destroyed the stock of the company for his own personal aggrandizement and ego gratification. By the way, my politics are independent. They don't sound it. I poke fun. I have at American politicians for years. Sometimes I thought I might be a stand-up comic and be able to command the salary that Jimmy Fallon commands for poking fun at the politicians because they're easy to poke fun at. I've always had a lot of fun with presidents, Republicans and Democrats. So it sounds critical. Don't let it make you think it biases my work on the business cycle. Only if they can affect policy, confidence. In this case, change the U.S. position in the geopolitics of the world. That's going on. That is potentially a huge negative for the U.S. economy on a longer run basis. But when I look at the goings on, I must say I side with the 80-year-old who looks like she's 50, Nancy Pelosi. When I get plastic surgery, I want to know who her doctor was. She called him the other day a petulant president. Women have a way of getting us in the gut, you know, in a one-liner, especially American women. Unbelievable how they can get you. She's incredibly good and incredibly tough. I worked with Nancy Pelosi through the crises and Barney Frank with the Democratic caucus. I also worked with Vice President Cheney and people around him before that as independent advisor on policy. And I have story after story that I tell with humor and fondness of the people I worked with, because they all want to do the best for their country, but they disagree on how to do it. And the personalities are very different. How could I get along with Nancy Pelosi? She's a very liberal Democrat. I love her passion as a liberal. She's too liberal for me, but I love it. We need to have people like that speaking out. I'm all for Senator Warren saying all the things she says. It's got to hang out there in a democracy. That's my view of our country. It's got to hang out there. We debate it, and ultimately we have always come to the right conclusion. On the right, Vice President Cheney, have you seen the American movie Vice? You should see it. That is he was thought to be the Darth Vader, the Machiavelli behind a kind of lightheaded President Bush, who sometimes showed me flashes of brilliance in meetings I was in with him. And Vice President Cheney, I can tell you story after story, really did have a sense of humor. Does that mean I admire what he did in Guantanamo Bay and all the rest, and the manipulation of the president that this movie depicts? Not my way. I served as an advisor. I did the best I could and found him to be a very, very bright man. He flunked out of Yale. And in the movie, his wife, like all wives, lift us up, get us going in the morning when we're little boys and when we're grown men. Thank God for women. It's really good that they're out there. Well, in any case, we have what we have. And I do think, and this is a subjective assumption, one way or the other, he will not be president at the end of 2020. If he gets control of the FBI, gets control of the Army, puts all his people there, and the Supreme Court gets one more appointment to the Supreme Court, it is possible that he could take over the country the way Latin American dictators and despots have. And in a paranoid way, I tell my friends, don't take him for granted. He's not a fool. He's not a buffoon. He knew how to campaign in 2016, and Mrs. Clinton didn't. And as a result, we have chaos, uncertainty, unpredictability, and a president who lies more times in a day than anybody in this room has lied, big or small, in his or her lifetime. So when I looked from 36,000 feet up, where you get some perspective, am I going to put my money in the dollar with that? Cautious investor with my capital. Will I put it in the yuan, the Chinese currency? Well, they're having trouble. They're going down. In the yen, absolutely. In treasury securities for now, absolutely. Even in gold. And there is an edge off the allocation of funds across stock markets because of this uncertainty that I'm describing in a somewhat, sounds biased, but I think I understand what we got there. We have a lot of psychiatrists in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I live near Cambridge. They treat each other. There's so many of them. It's a good business. And what they will say in private, they will not say in public or on television, because doctors don't make diagnoses. It's against the law without knowing a patient and the history. But they all think this is a psychologically sick man. And I do think that. So I think at the end of the day, Americans will put him out one way or the other, because I don't think he represents our country the way most Americans, even some of his followers, want to be represented. But we'll see. The economy marches on. It's the business cycle. We're in a good place in the business cycle. Interest rates are still relatively low, and we have fiscal stimulus, some increased government spending stimulus on a 3-year horizon. None of that's going to hurt us. It's all going to help. And the U.S. pro-business, pro-growth agenda of Trumponomics was put into place, deregulation of regulations, fighting on trade to get some advantage back to the United States. That is happening. Medical care did not happen. President Trump sticks at his agenda point by point by point, and business people give him credit for that. Because in the United States, I don't think we've had a president who stuck to an agenda the way business people stick to a plan. This man is tenacious. Nothing gets in his way. He's persistent. He keeps going at it, right or wrong. The wall is an example. Who are we dealing with? A bunch of kids in a playpen down in Washington. That's our political system. I've been part of it, but I've been this critical. I basically have said I'm going to say it again, and we'll say it. So I can say, they'll just say he's old and he's a little crazy. If I had to do Washington all over again to drain the swamp, I would fire everybody. I would never have 436 members of the House of Representatives running around raising money all the time, playing the games they play. They don't work full days for a full day's pay, not the way I and people I know work or the way ordinary Americans work. That's what goes on in our system. We can vote on every issue on our computer. I can do everything on my iPad. I carry with me, it's there now, everywhere I go. It's easy technology. All of America can vote on every issue, every moment, every day. We don't need them. We can save all that money, spend it more wisely on education, infrastructure, by vote of the people. But what I've said will never happen, not in my lifetime unless I live an awfully, awfully long time, and we have a revolution, and I won't be the leader of that revolution because I'm too old for that kind of thing. The composition of the world has changed. And China now clearly at 17% of global GDP, up from 4% in 2000, is the big deal. Japan is a little under 7% of GDP. It was 15% in 2000. The emerging world, less China, 17%, used to be 12%. And Europe down some. So the emerging world, Asia and particularly China, have really leapt up in terms of the lineup of global economic composition. So the U.S. can no longer guarantee on its own that the rest of the world will do well. And indeed, that was the story of 2018. The U.S. had a terrific year. Japan did not, struggling, some of it third quarter specific, but growth in Japan maybe 0.8%. We're forecasting 1.25% this year. Low interest rates, low inflation, but there is a sales tax increase coming. The consumer lags in Japan. For Korea, I think the figure here I tossed out, I believe, was about 3%. I was expecting a good year, reasonably low inflation here, low interest rates, stable to somewhat declining yuan, I probably said. And it looks like about 2.6% and 2.5% to 3% coming. That is tolerable. That's 4 years of nice growth for South Korea. This is not the booming economy, 5% growth it used to be, but it's a very nice trade surplus, diminishing a bit as part of GDP, low inflation, a relatively low unemployment rate, stable in the 3s. Looks like a good year for South Korea, with risks as the whole world faces on the slowing economy in China and what that will do to exports of South Korea and other countries out here in Asia. As for China, the momentum of growth definitely slowing down in the second half of last year. We get a GDP number we think will be 6.5% year over year. That's still a high number, but next year 6, maybe a little lower. And then from stimulative policy, a weaker Chinese currency, and an ending to the trade negotiations, which will end up with some redressing in the U.S. favor. But the negotiations, we're assuming, will come to an end this year. And something tangible, both sides will say was good, will help the Chinese economy do better. But that's later this year in terms of it helping Asia. In Europe, the European economy disappointed. The momentum ending the year is weaker. We're not expecting any non-U.S. country or region to raise interest rates in 2019. Japan to stay with its low-rate policy. Inflation is running under 1%. It's a long way from 2% target. And certainly China interest rates will not go up. And Europe interest rates in the front end are negative. We don't expect any hike in the second half of the year because inflation is just going to run too low. That's a very nice setting for a better world economy as we go through the year and the year after. Next year, sustained expansion. The U.S. expansion has going for it very good underpinnings, fundamental underpinnings for households and businesses. It has going for it tremendous growth in jobs and income. That powers spending. It has going for it still accommodative monetary policy and lots of funding. It has going for it fiscal stimulus. Trade will get weaker. It always does when the U.S. economy picks up because we bring in more imports and our exports weaken, particularly when other countries are not doing so well. And the deficits that we're going to grow because of the fiscal stimulus will not really do us in on the 3-year horizon that we're looking at here. Longer run, the U.S. is likely to have problems. They're beyond the scope of conversation today. I'm not all that optimistic. Part of the pessimism is pessimism about Washington and the way our government operates. It's just not sustainable. It's not tenable in a country like the United States. Well, inflation, the last question to try to answer and provide some insight into, and then a couple of risks to worry about. The answer to the question, why is inflation so low so many places in the world? For almost all central banks with a 2% target, lower than the target, indicating those central banks will not be raising interest rates. They may hold them where they are. And you could not rule out, if the U.S. economy has a negative turn for some reason, you couldn't rule out a cut in interest rates as the data unfold. Our Federal Reserve is in transition. It's making policy very differently now that we have essentially achieved the dual objective of full employment and price stability, but we're short on price stability. Inflation is too low for the 2% target, which is why our Federal Reserve and Chair Powell have indicated, has nothing to do with Trump's pressure, indicated that the Federal Reserve will be more gradual and will wait to see how things develop. That's a change for the better in terms of lower interest rates. But behind it all is low inflation. And why low inflation? Well, let me just talk about the U.S. for the moment. The low inflation is summarized in an old law called the Phillips curve that has died another death in the U.S. It actually only worked in the 1960s. It is a relationship discovered by an English economist, A.W. Phillips, and a two-variable relationship between the unemployment rate and price inflation and also wage inflation, where the unemployment rate, as it gets lower, is associated with, because this is a correlation, not necessarily a causation, associated with a rise in the inflation rate. Wage inflation feeding into price inflation feeding into wage inflation, cost inflation, and accelerating inflation once the economy gets tight in the labor market, hence the association between the unemployment rate and inflation. It was found in data, a scatter diagram in Great Britain, seemed to work for the U.S. It was named after the originator, A.W. Phillips, and became a famous law, the underpinnings of which analytically were put to us economists by Milton Friedman quite beautifully, quite elegantly, and by a Nobel Prize winner, Ed Phelps. Now over time, the Phillips curve and the unemployment rate that is associated with it, the full employment rate of unemployment called the natural rate. It's a construct. Like the neutral rate of interest, that's a construct. Like potential growth, that's a construct. These things don't exist. They're constructs. They're analytical constructs. The natural rate was that rate or full employment rate of unemployment at which inflation accelerates. And for policymakers then who want to prevent inflation from accelerating, they watch the unemployment rate, and as it gets low enough, the natural rate would be reached. And when you approach that natural rate, monetary policy should be tightened. That's the policy rule off this relationship. The relationship has not worked since the 1980s. Like a lot of relations in economics, it happens, you see it in the data, we economists invent stories around it. The stories sound good because the data support it, and then we have a myth that is not reality. That's my view of the Phillips curve. This time around, we're at 3.9% unemployment, and the rate of inflation is falling. Why? Reason number one, we still have slack in the U.S. and world economies. Slack, even though growth in the U.S. is above potential growth, it isn't in other parts of the world. We have slack, less demand pull. In the U.S., our research says we have more productivity growth and potential growth, supply side of the economy, and the tax cuts will help that than most think. So we have more slack on the supply side than is conventionally thought. Behind this is technology and the huge disruption, transformational, innovational technology that is this business cycle's technological change. It's huge. It's worldwide. I've never seen anything like it. We don't have enough data on it to get it into our models properly. What we have done with the little bit of data we can use is to find that technology that I've described and the companies that participate in it and the capital stock that comes from that has shifted the so-called Phillips curve down so we get a lower inflation rate for a lower rate of unemployment. That happened also in the late 90s when we had a different kind of technological change. In addition, we find higher productivity than is conventionally measured in the GDP accounts and GDP-derived accounts because of the role of technology. When enough data get in there, I believe that economists will sign on to this view. The Federal Reserve, I think, has signed on to the death of the Phillips curve. They have had to lower the natural rate, full employment, unemployment rate, I think 5 times in this business cycle, and they're not through yet. It's going to come down. We think it's about 3.5%. That's when we, and the forces that make that happen, will bring some inflation. But technology, very big. And then, finally, and this, unfortunately, we cannot explain. It's expected inflation in almost every country in the world, however you measure it, staying low, anchored low, and not going up. We have actual inflation because we expect it. We expect it because we have it. The brilliant one-liner of Bob Solow, Nobel Prize-winning economist, describing the statistical time series of actual and expected inflation. For however it works, and I have not been able to explain it with all my models and equations, there are stories you can tell about it. Expected inflation is very low. In part, that is helping to hold down actual inflation and hold down bond yields all around the world. Technology is part of it, because we all know anecdotally that we can buy stuff from anywhere in the world at lower prices, and we can all buy from Amazon, now the biggest company in the world. And that is having as yet unexplained, unknown effects, but it's crystal clear that I know when I buy from Amazon, everyone in the world's buying from Amazon because I'm the slowest person to adopt to these changes. And I buy everything cheaper at Amazon, and that's got to be affecting prices. There's all kinds of inventions going on in medicine in the United States, all around the world, all kinds of apps on the internet, all of which are driving price inflation down. And what companies are doing with technology to keep workers, even though we're growing a lot of jobs, they're mainly in the service sector. What they're doing to keep productivity up and margins up are beyond belief. That's all part of the low inflation. We think it's going to continue this year, and it's going to help. We will leave the correction. It may take a few more months, and I hope a year from now, the Korean stock market has had a 10% up year, which is what it should have. Let's go to questions.
Thank you very much for your comprehensive and thought-provoking presentation. Time is running out. Usually we have more time for Q&As, but today's time, time is pressing. So, but please, yeah.
Yes.
I'm a chief economist from Moscow, which is a very renowned global steelmaker. Really thank you for your illuminating lecture, especially about the Phillips curve argument. I was a little bit surprised that you were more optimistic than I thought about the U.S. economy. And actually, former FRB chairman Ben Bernanke was a little bit pessimistic about 2020. He told the media the U.S. economy hit also the Harvard professor Jeffrey Frankel was raising a possibility of new economic crisis as of last November. So I know that the U.S. economy is going well currently. So I want to hear about a little bit more about that. And also I want to ask a couple more questions. The first one is China's provincial debt and also corporate debt, especially the corporate debt to GDP ratio is above 250%, 160%. So what do you think of the debt and what could be the problem to China in the near future? And the third question is it's very related with the Korean economy. And then what do you think of the U.S. trade negotiation as of February or March? Thank you.
Sure. Very quickly on the Chinese economy, the overhang of financial excesses is quite extreme. And so the business sector, the real estate sector is overextended. The excesses are clear. And the debt ratios tell me that the Chinese economy will have to grow more slowly for a longer period of time. Now we're down from double-digit growth to in the sixes. And I said on a GDP basis, we're thinking for this next year, fourth quarter, 5.5% to 6%, down from about 6.5% year over year. So that is a good-sized slowdown in a very large economy, which reaches out to Japan, Korea, to U.S., because we do export to China. And so that is a fundamental risk and worry, and part of what the stock market correction is all about. China is very opaque. But the numbers tell me that the emerging world, including China, can sneak in a worse economy than I talked about, like in the late 1990s, via the business sector and weakening U.S. sales and profits that come out of our sales outside of the U.S. 45% of S&P 500 sales come from outside the U.S., which is way higher than 10 or 15 years ago. So this is a sneaky way. It's only happened once in 11 downturns that we can get a business sector motivated move toward recession or much slower growth. It is definitely a real risk. And I do think since growth is the issue for the stock market's looking out 6 to 12 months, and economic growth will affect earnings growth, and earnings growth is fundamental to the stock market. That's a lot about what this correction is all about. The trade is too small to do us in. It's not too small to do companies in who are in the crosshairs of that, but it's too small to do the economy in. The economy is 69.5% aggregate consumption and 15% aggregate spending by business, and 6.6% spending by the federal government. Those are all solidly up. That's 90% of the economy. Trade is not going to do us in. But the business sector could do us in by cutting back on hiring. That then would affect consumers, and we could evolve. So 6-7 months down the road, we would then be talking about recession in 2020. And I'll say this respectively because I'm going to say it about myself. I cannot tell you with any degree of precision or confidence when the next recession is in terms of what I look at. I don't think, have we known it? Well, the record shows that we've gotten every turning point ahead of time on the U.S. economy, downturn and upturn, since whatever organization I was associated with or ran since the late 1970s. That's the hardest part of forecasting. I haven't missed a turning point in 36 years or 38 years. I can't count that so long. It doesn't mean that I won't miss the next one. So I'm looking for how it happens. And I can't tell you because inside the U.S. economy, the kind of stuff that's going on and on the inflation interest rate side is just not the stuff that makes for recessions. A war, some crazy adventure that President Trump gets us into, yeah. What happens if we have impeachment? What kind of chaotic world does the U.S. come into? What does a beleaguered president do? What happens to confidence? These are external shocks that do throw us into downturns. But even these, I think, wouldn't do it because the underpinnings of the U.S. economy are so strong. So it's tough to see it. So I don't know how Chair Bernanke or anybody can say that we might fall off a cliff at the end of 2020. I don't think anybody could say that. I can't say it, and I have more reason to say it than a lot of people because I've got a record. And it doesn't matter what the record is. I can't see it now.
Does it answer your question? Perhaps one last question because of the
Yes.
Mr. Kim.
Since time is running out, I will ask one short question. What is your prognosis of resolution of this government shutdown between the Trump and the Congress? How do you think this will evolve?
The question is about the shutdown.
Yeah.
And you had a question about the trade negotiations. It's bizarre. The election of 2016 was a black swan event. I'm sure I said that last year. 2017 when I came here, 2017 after the election. It's weird. It shouldn't have happened. The shutdown, the length of it, makes very little sense. But the President of the United States and the goings-on in Washington to people with half a brain of common sense doesn't make any sense. I have no idea. In the art of the deal, the president will double down and keep on fighting for it. He has already given in some. It's not a wall now, it's a screen. And the Democrats, led by Ms. Pelosi, are winning the battle, according to most reports, of who gets the blame for it. And I did not ask the TSA guy last night who he's going to vote for in the next election to find out what he thought. The guy who's not getting paid. How would you like to be that guy? He was smiling. He was happy. He was doing his job. I thanked him. As a citizen, I thanked him for putting up with all this stuff. It resolves. And what they're arguing about is just total nonsense. 5.7 versus $1.7 billion, and the ego gratification of a wall, a barrier. We all agree that security is important. We should check the immigrants when they come in. We need to protect our border. There are 1,000 ways to do it, and why Washington can't arrive at a way to do it. I'm going to send all my Cambridge psychiatrists down to Washington and see if they can figure it out.
I think we would have to close this forum unless there is urgent question from the press. Okay.
Go ahead. We'll give you one. We'll give you one more.
Okay. Anyone on the press raise a question?
Well, I'm going to tell you one story and try to make it very quick. My only encounter with the president, who I have kiddingly referred to as, did I use the word insane, madman? I don't know what I said here. But it's not repeatable. But anything I said, by the way, that is negative about the President of the United States, it should not be reported. I'm not ready to leave the country yet. But I did have one conversation with him a long time ago, in 1999, on the phone. And I grew up in the Midwest, in Detroit, kind of poor family. So a lot of what President Trump says resonates with me about how America takes advantage of lower income families and all that. I'm a bit of a maverick, a rebel. Somehow found myself part of what's called the intellectual elite of the East Coast. Never dreamed I'd be there. But I don't think like they think. I really think instinctively and notice that President Trump strikes a lot of chords that resonate with me. Fairness on trade. The system is gimmicked. Things that he has said that I totally resonate. I can't vote for a man who I don't want to represent our country because of what he is. but some of the stuff makes sense. The economic program, you hear how optimistic we are. Anyway, we ski, as members of the elite do, although we were not, in Aspen, Colorado, which at this point has got the most expensive real estate in the United States. We went there as a young couple. And Donald Trump was there a lot, skiing the slopes of Aspen like all the celebrities do, with one woman after another. He was in all the newspapers and always had a big following in the press, kind of a playboy, rich playboy type. That's how I knew him. Plus his claims to Forbes that he was worth $5 or $10 million. He would call Forbes every year on the list of the world's richest men. He would complain that he wasn't on the list or he should be higher on the list, but he would never give his numbers out. He would never let them look at anything. So I immediately picked up the kind of guy he was. And then he had an abortive, he was going to run for president in 2000. He was thinking in 1990 of running for president. He had a proposal. And his proposal was, get this, a wealth tax. A tax of, I think, 10% on balance sheets over $10 million. He was supposedly a rich guy. Notice the liberal left is touting that as a way to deal with inequality. I do too. I think we tax the mega rich at a higher rate, take the money, and we use it for social purposes and lower income families. Interesting idea. I got called by the Washington Post to comment on various programs, and they asked me to comment on his program. I don't like to say anything that gets in the press that's offensive. I actually don't like saying anything that's offensive. So I said, and this is true, that's an interesting idea. It is worthy of consideration. Now, what could be more Delphic-like than worthy of consideration? Perfect. I thought I gave a perfect quote. A month later, I'm traveling on the road. I get a call from my secretary. He says, there's a man on the phone who wants to talk to you. He says he's Donald Trump. I said, I don't know any Donald Trump. I've never met him in my life. Probably a joke. Somebody's just joking around. I said, I won't take the call. 5 minutes later, she calls back. The man, he says he's really Donald Trump. He's persistent. So I took the call. And he says, hi, Alan. This is Donald Trump. I love your work. I think you're the greatest economist that ever lived. Well, does anybody mind hearing something like that? So I thought to myself, this is really bullshit, but I knew what. And he said, and I really liked your comment about my program. And I said, yeah, it's an interesting idea. It's worthy of consideration. I thought that was harmless. It was probably the most favorable comment of any of the comments about his program. And he said, the rich people don't like me, so they don't like my proposal. I thought to myself, but you're rich. They don't like you. You're in real estate. You made a lot of money, or so you think. I didn't dare say that. I thought that. He said, the people I really get along with, this is a true story. It's amazing. 1999. People I get along with are the ordinary people, the workers, the construction workers. I go down and talk to them. We really hit it off. I understand them. They understand me. Now, I didn't recall that remark until the election of 2016, and I saw who he was courting. That's how he viewed it. He gets on well with those people, somehow he thought. So to be helpful, because I always try to be helpful, no matter what, I said, well, since you said you have enemies, the thing you want to be careful of is to be sure you got the numbers right in your program, because in this day and age, it's easy to hire a technical person like me, and if there are any inconsistencies in your numbers, they're going to get you and get to your credibility. He said, oh, no, we got lots of economists working on it, but you don't know any of them. You don't know any of them. I know all the economists in the world. So that was it. Then he said, thanked me again. He said, if I can ever do you a favor, please call me anytime. And I thought, I do need $100,000 in revenue, but I didn't believe he'd be a client. Now I know that what he does do is he doesn't pay his bills. So I'm glad I didn't take him on as a client, because he probably would have bled me blind and never paid a bill. That conversation, that's the man, my only experience with him. It's very enlightening. It's very enlightening. That's what we're dealing with in the United States. So I think you need to wish us luck, because it's in your interest, and hope that America gets through this chaotic period, and the world does, in as fine a fashion as I've described you today. Thanks very much for coming.
Thank you very much.